Get started today. I want to say welcome to everyone. My name is Katie Cardarelli, and I am Senior Associate Provost for Administration and Academic Affairs at the University of Kentucky. I'm also the immediate past chair for the Kentucky ACE Women's Network. And for those of you who might be joining us today for the first time, just a word or two about the network. We are committed to advancing women, staff, and faculty in higher education. We are an affiliate of the American Council on Education's Women's Network. We're very proud of what we have built over the last few years in terms of growing our membership. And I think if you look around the Zoom room, you'll see we have folks here today from across a number of different institutions. So I'm really excited to see everyone here today. So I have the pleasure of introducing today's guest speaker, Dean J. Miller. J. Miller was appointed Dean and Dorothy A. Miller Research Professor in Social Work Education in July of 2019. At the time of his appointment, Dean Miller was the youngest dean in the country. He earned his bachelor's degree from Western Kentucky University, his Master of Social Work from Spalding University, and his PhD from the University of Louisville. Dean Miller is dedicated to a host of social issues and community outreach, a passion that he brings to his work as an educator and a scholar. His research and academic interests focus on child welfare and youth involvement in juvenile systems. But in addition to this, Dean Miller is actively leading research related to self-care and wellness. In 2017, he founded the Self-Care Lab, and the Self-Care Lab is the first known lab specifically dedicated to empirically investigating self-care among health professionals. Dean Miller has conducted groundbreaking research on broad-ranging self-care and wellness research with social workers, educators, nurses, law enforcement, teachers, and attorneys, among others. The impact of his work has been recognized regionally, nationally, and internationally. And of note for today's session, he co-edited the A to Z Self-Care Handbook for Social Workers and Other Helping Professionals, which I have on my bookshelf here behind me. And last but certainly not least, Dean Miller is a loud, proud foster and kinship alum. So please join me in welcoming Dean J. Miller to the Kentucky ACE Women's Network session today.
Thank you, Dr. Cardarelli. I certainly appreciate the time and space to talk about self-care. I'm making note that you're a stickler for time because I'm not. I tend to kind of ramble on, and it would be very ironic to have a self-care session go over time. So I want to take the time today to kind of walk through some broad-ranging concepts that we've been able to explore over the last few years as it relates to self-care, particularly for folks working in higher ed. I'll work with Dr. Cardarelli and others to make sure that I circulate some additional resources. Self-care is a broad, expansive topic, and while I could talk about it for days, it's hard to pack down or cook down into an hour. So I want to make sure that you all have the things that you all need to be supported in kind of actualizing some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can we all see that?
Yes.
Awesome. And I can circulate this on the backside and if we need to. All right, so I'll kind of skip past some of the pleasantries. So I want to dive right in to kind of set up and frame the discussion for today. As I discussed earlier, self-care is this broad-ranging concept, and there are a lot of things, misnomers, myths related to the concept of self-care. And so I want to really take the time to have some discussion around what we know about the concept, and perhaps more importantly, what we think we should know, why we should care, and then what we can do, really kind of digging down into some of the strategies, successes, et cetera, that we've experienced or seen as it relates to the concept of self-care and some of the things that we've learned about in the research. If you have questions as we go, please drop those in the chat. I'll try to respond to those. While I recognize we're in Zoom, I want this to be a very interactive discussion in so much as it can be. So I always kind of start off with saying that self-care is a journey, not a destination. And my journey to studying self-care is one that is very personal. As Katie indicated earlier, I grew up in foster care. So having grown up in foster care, I knew at a very early age, I wanted to go into helping professional services. And what that meant for me is I was going to go work in child protective services. And I know it sounds odd for to think about the quintessential story of having a dream of wanting to go work for CPS, but that's what I wanted to do. And you could not tell me that I was not going to save all of the kids. And that's really kind of how I approach the work. So I graduate college and I go in and I start working at CPS. And I really had this frame or notion in my mind that the work needed to be done in a certain way. And I had that notion because I had been on the other side. So I was in a space to remove kids and place them in foster care. And I thought that that needed to be done a certain way because I had been there. I wanted to engage and work with families, whatever that meant and whatever that looked like, because I had been there. I wanted to spend as much time and pour myself into the work because I knew what the other side was like. And what that meant is, as I began to do the work and go through year one and year two, I found that all I did was worked. I would go in the morning at 8 o'clock and start my job during the day. I worked for state government. So at 4:30, I would leave my downstairs job and go upstairs to another division and continue child abuse investigations. I would do those till 1 or 2 in the morning, and I'd start back again at 8 o'clock. I was always on, never off, because I thought the work needed to be done in a certain way. Because if you remember, I had been there. And I'd always committed to myself that when I removed a child and had to take them to another home, that I would never leave them in a space that I wouldn't have wanted to been left in. And I remember distinctly the day that I went out and I dropped off a kid and I didn't feel good about the place that I was leaving them, and I left them anyway. Because I had got to a point where I was burned out, I was jaded, and there was nothing left of me to give to that work. And so while the majority of my academic career has been spent doing research in the space of child welfare, and particularly foster youth and adoptive youth, what I found is that if I wanted to impact that system, I needed to do research and understand the folks that were doing work in that space. Because if I could get to the point where I was jaded and burned out and I had been there, I could only imagine what my colleagues were experiencing. So for some reason, I decided I was going to write and put together this book. And I've been trying to get away from self-care ever since, because what we realized is as we begin to share this information about self-care, it's a concept that many folks struggle with. Several years ago, I got a research grant to do a study about the concept of self-care among helping professionals. And when I say helping professionals, I'm talking about teachers, social workers, nurses, etc. And I remember even in my academic space, folks said, well, don't do research on self-care. You can't get tenure that way. And it's not really a science thing. And folks think about yoga and bubble baths when they talk about self-care. They don't think about the science of it. And I kind of ignored all the mess and kind of stayed the course, launched the Self-Care Lab, which is the first ever space in the world to be wholly dedicated to the concept of empirical investigation as it relates to self-care. And ever since then, we have been burning on both sides as it relates to really trying to understand the concept of self-care and how we can support folks in engaging in self-care. Not only do we do work kind of at the state and national level, but we also have about 16 or 17 formal partnerships with other academic institutions around the world who are also doing work and research in the space of self-care. So it's been a really holistic, fulfilling experience for me. And it's really another way to craft and tackle some of the concepts that we see, not only in the broader helping professional disciplines, but increasingly in higher ed. And when I became a dean, it was interesting to kind of take those concepts that we had learned about self-care in relation to the research and apply those in the academic space, because what we found is that a lot of the dynamics that folks face in the broader professional spheres are mirrored in our academic spaces. As I always say, the university is a microcosm for things happening around it. And so while burnout, et cetera, is pervasive in other spaces, it's also the same in academia. So just real quick in the chat, if you could, when I say self-care, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? What do you think about immediately? I say self-care, you think what? Me time, naps, got them. Amazon boxes, okay. Remember that one, we'll come back to that one. Rest, time, okay. So we see time is a really pervasive factor, and we'll talk about it, that particular concept here in a bit. When you think about self-care, I think that a lot of times we get mired in this really complex web of things, in part because we're inundated with messaging around self-care. And when we start thinking through what we know or what exists around the concept of self-care. Sorry, I'm trying to get this to, there we go. What we know about the concept of self-care, and particularly as it applies to our academic spaces, we really have to first understand what we know and what research has showed us about working in an academic space. When you look at a lot of the existing information that really tries to examine and explore higher ed, we find that there are a multitude of different studies, no matter the professional discipline or academic area, that talk about the high levels of stress and occupational burnout among academic faculty and staff. We hear and see a lot around harassment, bullying and mobbing, the kind of concept of these power differentials within academia that really are pervasive and exist, but we don't really talk about. Isolation, when we think about the traditional academic tucking away and doing their work in their corner or their space. And we see it a lot with staff as well. And then the concept of role confusion, meaning in academia, there are not a lot of things that are defined in a way that is clear and consistent across context. And all of those things can make academia and working in or within academia a really difficult and challenging space. And what we know from a lot of the existing research is that these issues can be more problematic or can be compounded for folks who identify as female or identify as an individual from an underrepresented group. And that's both for faculty and staff. And if you take all of these things and you kind of layer the concept of the contemporary global issues that we're dealing with, it really makes for a space where academia and working in academia can be a hard and challenging thing. But oftentimes we don't do or spend enough time and attention talking about what we can do based on some of these things that we know. So if we think about all of these things that we're faced with on a perpetual and ongoing basis, if we think about the fact that these things can be compounded for females and folks from other underrepresented groups, what we also know and what's very clear from a lot of the research is that self-care can really assuage a lot of these professional and personal phenomena. So there are a number of different studies. And we've done several of them that look at the impact that self-care can have on a lot of these spaces that are problematic for academia. So in addition to your vicarious trauma, meaning, how you experience or take on the stuff of others, stress or secondary stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, turnover, professional efficacy, we know and can show from research that self-care can help to address all of these problematic phenomena. Yet, when we think about academia, there are very few studies that have explicitly looked at the concept, and there are even fewer models for how do we approach self-care and wellness in the academic space. Now, you do typically find a lot of anecdote, literature, et cetera, related to human resource functions and self-care and wellness. But what we also know is that increasingly folks are looking for flexible models, meaning spaces that allow them to actualize wellness in whatever way they see fit. I often joke in the self-care space that just because you build it does not mean they will come. And typically what happens is we roll out some kind of wellness initiative. Folks don't participate. We think that folks don't want to participate. And I really often say that they want wellness, they just don't want it the way that we're framing it out. And so we have to get to a space where we're thinking about self-care and wellness, particularly in the academic space, much differently, because we know that there are challenges. And we also know that self-care specifically can help us tackle a lot of those challenges. We also know that self-care is a really tricky thing to put our hands around. And it's because self-care occurs in this broader context of contemporary stuff, meaning there are broad-based conditions that impact the way that we think and interact with wellness and self-care more generally. So you think about your meso, macro, meta conditions, which are the organizational level factors that impact the way we think or interact with self-care. And then you think about all of our individual circumstances that impact the way that we think about wellness. So it's no wonder to think that or understand that self-care is really, really difficult. There are a number of reasons why, and here are just a few that we've identified in doing some research over the years. And a lot of this is based on some research that we've done with faculty members, particularly in spaces of social work, nursing, and teaching. And so we find that folks will struggle with this consumeristic feel-good culture. A lot of folks equate self-care to buying a product, and that's very intentional from spaces where folks will say, well, if you just buy this thing, you'll feel better. Or if you just get this thing, you'll kind of be welled up or self-cared up. And we buy it and we go through it and we experiencing it, and it doesn't get us to where we want to be. Or somebody mentioned the Amazon box situation earlier, right? Like we think that they have a term, retail therapy, I think is what my wife refers to it as. But it's this thing where you think I'm just going to buy stuff and I feel good in the immediate, but it doesn't get us to a sustained place of wellness. And frankly, it actually sometimes can create other challenges, which we'll talk about later. Competing professional priorities. A lot of times we think about the value associated with what we do, and we just have a lot of competing professional priorities. Oftentimes the things that we use to describe good employees are the same things that lead people to burnout and stress. For example, I was having a conversation last week with another dean at another institution, and we were talking about the qualities of a good faculty member. And he was sharing with me that folks come early and they stay late and they're always available and they're always working and they're putting out all these publications and putting out all these proposals. And I said, well, don't you realize the other side of that, meaning the burnout and the stress, et cetera, that goes along with that work? And it was just very interesting that in describing a good faculty member, he was also describing the very things that were going to lead people to a space of not being able to sustain that work. Limited conceptions of self-care. I want people to understand from the outset that when it comes to self-care, your way of thinking is a way and not the way. And so many times we get kind of caught up in this concept of saying self-care is this or self-care is that. For example, folks will say, hey, Jay, did you do yoga? And I said, no, I hate yoga. I've tried it. I fall asleep. Just not my thing. They say, oh, well, you don't practice self-care because you don't do yoga. And nothing could be further from the truth. You have to kind of think about how we or you might define self-care and understand that that's a limited conception because not everyone defines it in the same way. So it does make it hard to think about and talk about because if all of us are thinking about it differently, we all have different spaces or come from it from different places. And so we have these limited conceptions that don't really help us along. There's also historically, if you look at the literature, self-care is not this come lately fad. It's actually, there was a 60-minute show with Dan Rather from the 60s that talked about the concept of self-care. And they called it this kind of weird cultural phenomenon that folks were grappling with then. But historically, self-care has been viewed from a medical model that looks at the self-care of folks who are patients to deal with medical issues. And so that's really kind of framed the way that a lot of professionals think about self-care, meaning it's for someone else and not for me. And so that makes it really difficult to think about or engage in self-care in any kind of meaningful way. And then unrealistic expectations, that this concept that somehow we are all going to be well all the time and never experience stress and have these perfect work situations. If you work that out, please let me know because I would love to be in that space. But it's an unrealistic expectation of not only how we think about wellness, but it also transcends over into workload. One of the things that we talk about a lot in my college is the evolving standards. If you think about junior faculty, for example, where 10 years ago, you might be able to get tenure with X number of publications and X number of grants or teaching X number of courses. And now you have junior faculty doing that each year. And so we often think about or worry about what these evolving expectations mean and at what point do we think about what's too much and how much should we be taking on. So all of these things, in addition to others, get us in a space to where self-care can be a really, really difficult thing, not only to talk about, but to tackle in any kind of broad ranging way. That said, it can be done if you understand some of the concept and context related to self-care and how we need to engage in it.
Hey, Jay, can I just, I guess, make a comment or
Sure.
ask you a comment? When I've heard you talk about this previously, what really resonated, yeah, here we go. This is exactly what I wanted to get to, is this concept of guilt. That if there's all these expectations, and if I carve out a part of my day to work out, for example, I feel guilty.
Yes. Well, I think this is the thing, right? So there's the mix of being selfish and being guilty. And it's interesting because if you just stop and think about it for a second, the fact that taking care of yourself is somehow selfish or would make you feel guilty, just on its face, like when you say it out loud, it doesn't sound right. And I think it's kind of really rooted in this concept that everyone else's needs are more important than my own. And it comes from a historic space, particularly around helping professions or helping disciplines. And you'll hear me talk about that a lot because it has shaped the way that we view health and wellness. And so when I say helping disciplines, if I said, what is the common thing about the professionals who make up the professional disciplines of teaching, nursing, and social work? What would you say is the most common characteristics of folks who do that?
Females.
Yes, they overwhelmingly identify as females. And what you see historically is that there's this concept of, well, you take care of everybody else and you can take care of yourself maybe later if you get time and I don't need something. Like that's been how we've kind of socialized folks. And there is a very gendered take on how we think about self-care and wellness. And whereas folks who identify female historically have been in a space to where their wellness is defined and conceptualized by how well they take care of others around them. And that has really put a gendered space in kind of how we think about self-care and wellness. And it's also ascribed this label of guilt. I was working with we do some self-care accountability groups through the lab. And I use this example often. I was working with a group of folks, and there was a woman about to go on a maternity leave. And she was working on a team of social workers. And so we were kind of talking about, what folks were thinking and how they were going to, deal with somebody being gone. And it was interesting that while the team wanted to be really excited for her because she was going to have her first kid and all these things that go along with that, they also felt a little angry because all they could think about was how they were going to divide up these cases while she was gone. And it made her in turn feel guilty. And so when, again, you stop and think about the fact that someone's about to go create life literally, and they're feeling guilty about leaving their space, it just really says a lot about how we think about health and wellness. So we get done with this. There's two things I want you to remember. All right. And here's the first one. Number one, your needs are as, if not more important than the people you serve. And I'm using the word serve very intentionally, meaning your students, they're great and their needs need to be met, but their needs are no more important than yours. The folks in your office who have needs, those needs are no more important than yours, because we have to get into a space where you understand that your needs need to be met or at least attended to so that you can do the work that we're asking you to do. Now, it's not to say that those two value propositions are connected. It's simply to give you the what should be non-radical permission to say that your needs are important and have to be met. And so I remember the first time I said that in front of a group of social workers, and folks like to fell out in the floor because you just can't say that out loud. That's not something you say, but it's really where we need to get to in terms of understanding that if we are going to be well, we have to understand that our needs are as important as the folks or client base or students or whomever that we work with. But when you start to tackle other myths and misnomers and misconceptions, there are many about self-care. Number one, that self-care is monolithic, meaning there is a one size fits all to self-care, and there is not. I am a gym, CrossFit type person. Other folks are not. Again, I've tried yoga, it doesn't work for me. I've tried meditation, I just kind of fall asleep. It's not my thing, but other people get into that. And so we have to understand that self-care is not monolithic, and that we have to create, understand, and know that folks engage in it in different ways. And so we need to be open to different conceptions of self-care. Of course, that self-care is selfish. That's probably it is based on some of the research that we hear, the second most prolific myth that folks talk about. Again, caring for oneself is selfish. A lot of that's rooted in the concept of, I call it the helping profession curse. It's that historic space of where certain professional disciplines, which frankly have been gendered, get into a space of their value is attributed to how they serve others. The third one is that self-care is some kind of emergency reaction to a crisis. This is one, my head almost explodes every time I hear the mask analogy where, oh, you have to pull down your mask and you have to put on your mask before you help the others around you. BS, I'm calling BS. It's not a thing, because self-care is not a reactionary position. Self-care should be an integrated way of being. It's a way that you approach living life. You don't wait for something to happen. I've written extensively about the concept of self-care, both as prevention and intervention. And so self-care can prevent things from happening or you experiencing certain things that you otherwise would if not for practicing self-care. So self-care is not an emergency reaction, although we will often frame it that way. Self-care is not an ancillary activity, meaning it is not something that occurs outside of your regular life. It's something that needs to be integrated into your life. It's not about the what we do, it's about the how we do. And so it's important that you view it not as something secondary. Folks will often say and talk about the concept of time. Well, I'll do self-care when I get time, or I'll do that when I get time. And it's 8 years later and you're still waiting for the time, right? Like there's never the perfect time to do self-care was yesterday, but today will work just fine. So it's not an ancillary activity. It's something that we have to do and tackle. And then again, the self-care is a consumeristic response. It goes back to this notion that somehow you can package and buy self-care in a way that will allow you to just immediately be in a space that is well and that will sustain you moving forward. So there are many different myths and misnomers. Ultimately, you have to be able to wade through some of those to get to a space of understanding what self-care is for you and what self-care is for those around you. If you think about why we should care, and when I first started doing and talking about self-care in these contexts, I took for granted that I needed to explain to people, or that we needed to have discussion about why I should care, because to me, it was always very straightforward. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we all come to our work, particularly in the education space, for what are most of the times very particular purpose-driven reasons. We want to impact people. We want to make a difference. We want to provide and afford folks the education. We want to shape lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In order to do that, you must be well. Do not convince yourself that somehow you can burn it at both ends going 1,000,000 miles an hour and that you're giving your best self. A lot of times as educators, we convince ourselves that we are. We convince ourselves that we're putting our best foot forward. But if you are burned out and jaded and stressed, you might be doing the best that you can, but that's not the best you could do. And so, interestingly, to do the very thing that we strive to do, self-care becomes a necessary element or a necessary part of how we do our work. If you think about why you should care, so this was a really interesting thing. You all, a lot of you all completed a screener, and it's always a really kind of dynamic discussion point. The screener is something that we've used over the years to, we developed it and we use it over the years to measure different aspects of self-care. Because while self-care practices are very unique and highly individual, there are some kind of universal concepts that we've identified as it relates to self-care. And so professional support, one where you think about folks who work around you and you have support to do whatever it is that you're doing as it relates to your work. Cognitive awareness, meaning you're aware of things that are happening around you to include your own well-being. Professional development, meaning there are opportunities for you to progress through professional spaces in a way that's efficient and works for you. Daily balance, meaning you can balance out the things that are happening in your life in a way that feels like it's balanced. And then life support, this concept that you have other supports in your life to help you and support you in things that are other than professional. And so I think the thing that was most interesting here is that across the board, these scores are a little lower than what we've seen historically in other spaces. For example, every one of these scores are lower than the last iteration that we did with nurses and social workers. Now, I think a lot of that could be connected to COVID. We've been doing a lot of research as of late around the concept of self-care and what we call paratraumatic distress, meaning stress that occurs or happens during an event. A lot of people talk about post-traumatic, but we really focused on the paratraumatic piece. I also think that the concept of daily balance being the lowest is really interesting because, again, this is I talked earlier about the first thing I want you to remember. Your needs are as important as everybody else's. Your needs are as important as everybody else's. We'll keep saying that. But then the second thing I want you to remember is that there is no such thing as work-life balance. I don't know where it came from. They need to take it back because it's this mythical concept that somehow you wake up in the morning. Let me see who's on here. Jennifer, can you hear me? I'm picking on Jennifer because she's the one I see on the screen.
Jennifer Fairchild?
Jennifer Fairchild. Yep.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Jennifer's here. All right. Jennifer, what time you wake up in the morning?
6:30,
6:30. What time are you supposed to be at work?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. Okay. So because Jennifer is a good dedicated employee, she gets there at 7:59 every morning, ready to go because at 8 o'clock she's starting. So this concept of work-life balance would have you think that Jennifer wakes up at 6:30, does whatever she needs to do, gets to work at 7:59, walks in at 8, and somehow she says time out on her life, and that her life stops because now she's on work time, and that she works all day, and that whenever Jennifer's done, she says time in and she goes back to life. This concept of work-life balance to where they're these very separate things, that's just not how it works. Because I guarantee you, some of you probably right now are getting texts from kids who need this or partners that need that, or the bills are still clicking while you're on here. The work-life balance didn't get that part. So these things are happening, meaning it's not separate from. So instead of work-life balance, we choose to kind of engage with life balance, meaning work is a part of your life like everything else. And so approaching it in a way that's not dichotomous allows us to strategize around how to manage it differently. This piece of data shows that as a group, it's what we struggle with the most in terms of balancing things out. And again, I think when you think about context, that makes perfect sense, given that we're in the COVID space and virtual school is a mess, and I have an 8-year-old and I never know when I wake up whether they're supposed to go to school or not anymore because it's just all over the place. And it makes it really hard to balance out the way that we're approaching life. And these data show that. So ultimately, if you think about why you should care, it's because these data show that there are things that we're grappling with, and self-care can help us assuage challenges related to all of these individual areas. And if we're going to take a broad approach to dealing with self-care, we have to understand that there are universal concepts such as these that we can tackle, and that sometimes we have to do that in a way that focuses on each one of us as individuals. All right. So when we think about, we know academia can be stressful and we can get burned out. We know self-care can help us address that burnout and stress. And we know that we are in a space, meaning you on the call today, based on the data, that we need to be thinking about how to assuage some of these problematic professional and personal phenomena. So we need to think about wellness and self-care in a way that gets to us to a space where we can actualize our self-care and wellness to get us in a different space. So when we think about what we can do, we can reframe, refine, and reclaim. And that's really connected to these concepts of how we think about self-care. And when we think about reframing, that's kind of the fundamental concept. There are 3 principles that we'll often talk about. So number 1 is that self-care isn't a nicety, it's a necessity. We have to engage with self-care as if it is necessary to our work. Self-care is an important part of how we do our work. I don't focus on the what as much as we focus on the how. So no matter what it is you do, you have to think about how that is done and how you integrate that into your work, which gets to that principle number 2. Principle number 3 is a couple of years ago, I came up with this foundation around the self-care actualization theory. And it views self-care as a professional practice skill that can be fostered, learned, and developed. So it's not something that just instantaneously happens. Self-care is not an event, it's an experience. It's a way of going about living in the world. And so what the theory says is that we can foster and improve and work on self-care. And sometimes we're going to be really good at it and sometimes we're not. But because it's a professional practice skill, it's something that we can pick up and learn. So, in my college, for example, we actually teach a course on self-care practice. So the same way, I'm in social work. So the same way you would learn about clinical assessment and clinical intervention, or the same way we would teach you about how to do interviews, we teach you how to practice and engage in self-care because we look and view it as a skill that we can foster and develop. And so these are the three principles on which we need to reframe the way we think about self-care. It isn't a nicety. It's an important part of how we do work. And it is a skill that we can learn and develop. If you don't have it now, that's fine. You can learn and develop it over time. All right. When we get to the refine, there are kind of 5 steps that we think about. And number 1 is define self-care on your own terms. Don't let someone dictate to you what your self-care is. I work with a colleague, and it's interesting because we do this through this accountability group we have. We do these self-care plan check-ins. And I remember the very first time that she did a self-care check-in. We looked at her plan, and on her plan, she wanted to get into some physical activity. She hadn't done a lot of physical activity historically. My colleague, she's in her 60s, and she did the self-care plan. And one of her goals in her physical space was to run a marathon. And so I'm a runner, and so I got it, and I said, okay, because she wanted to kind of talk about what it meant to run a marathon. And as I'm looking at her plan, I said, well, tell me a little bit about your past as it relates to running. Like, have you ran before? And she said, nope, never ran before. I said, okay, because, I'm trying to be the supportive colleague. I said, all right, so let me know, like, when is this marathon? She said, oh, it's next month or so. And I said, no, not going to happen. So we need to have some kind of keep it real moments around how we define and think about self-care and how we define it on our own terms. But subscribing to someone else's self-care or concept of self-care puts you in a space for it to be difficult to actualize. It doesn't mean you can't take examples or ideas from folks, because there's been things that I've tried that I wouldn't have tried that kind of worked or I kind of liked once I did them. But you don't want to subscribe wholly to someone else's definition of self-care, because the perfect plan is the one that works for you. Number 2 is to think about planning. It's an often skipped thing when we talk about self-care. We actually have some exercises and such. And again, I'll circulate these resources afterwards, where we walk people through the concept of how to go about planning. So, we plan, and then we test, and then we plan some more. You have to remember that self-care happens by design, not by default. You're not going to wake up and accidentally stumble into some self-care. You have to think about and plan it as a way to actualize the goals that you want to have. Step 4, you get into assessing your plan. And then step 5, you redefine based on your success. So the core of refining is to come up with your own concept or definition for self-care practices, and then put things in place that make those practices more feasible, accessible, etc. All right. And then once you actualize the plan, it's something that you keep tinkering with. I encourage folks, you're going to need some critical friends that keep it real with you and let you know, hey, maybe you want to try this, or maybe you want to try that. Sometimes you need to be the critical friend. It's very hard sometimes to tell folks around us that what they're trying or what they want to do may not be working. But that's actually, I wake up every day and I say, I want to meet fair people today, not nice people. Because if I walk up to Katie, I say, hey, Katie, do you like my shirt that I have on? And Katie says, oh, I love it. It's great. And I said, do you really like it? And she says, yes. And then I walk out into the world and it's all messed up. And she's looking, everybody's wondering why I got this messed up shirt. Katie didn't do me any favors. Katie was just being nice to me because she thought that's what she needed to do. So having some critical friends around you that can help you on your self-care journey is really important to getting you to a space of being able to actualize your plan. And then reclaim is a huge part, because I like to talk about self-care as an actualization of self-love. And folks who know me know that for me to even talk about the concept of self-love just isn't something I would typically do. But I do think self-care and practicing self-care is a way that you communicate your value to others. It's a way of communicating how others should treat you. It's a way of communicating how you care for and or value yourself. And so when we view self-care like that, or in that frame, it puts us in a space to really reclaim what it means. And so when we think about what we need to do, again, we need to start self-care now. thinking about the perfect time or the ideal time, it's never going to come. So you start now with what you can do now, and then you progress and build accordingly. Be purposeful in your actions, meaning really taking time to think through what you want your self-care to be and how you want it to look. And then I always say act micro, but think macro. One of the big things that we often hear about self-care is this concept that it's someone else's responsibility, specifically the institution you work for. And so, we will often hear about, well, if the institution would just do this, or if they just had this wellness thing or that wellness thing, then I could take care of myself. And please don't hear me saying that those things aren't important. There need to be systemic responses to supporting folks to meeting their self-care and wellness goals. We definitely need those. But I encourage you to not wait on those things. Organizational concepts can be slow and take time, and they might not be built in a way that take into account your perspective. And so while they should, don't use that as an excuse to not care for yourself. Self-care is a highly individualized endeavor. There are universal concepts, but it's an individual endeavor. And so if you're waiting around for your organization to come up with something to help get you there, good luck, because it very seldom happens. And it's not to say that organizations are not responsive, because they are. It's simply to say that you shouldn't wait on that to reclaim and start engaging in self-care for you. So you need to act in a micro way, meaning as an individual, you take steps to be mindful of your self-care and what you need for your own wellness, while simultaneously working with, advocating, participating in macro-based organizational level endeavors. Because to create a wellness or self-care culture, we need both of those things. But again, one of the things that we hear a lot are that folks are just kind of waiting for their organization to come up with the right mix of things. And while organizations, they particularly now, they try really hard in most spaces to come up with innovative ways to support folks. It's not an easy thing to do, because everybody has their own unique approach. And so act micro, think macro. Don't wait on anybody to tell you what you need to do. You kind of take some steps, and then again, support and advocate and participate in organizational level endeavors that are aimed at your self-care or wellness. So again, we look to reframe, refine, and reclaim will get us to a space of starting to think about self-care in a different way. I do want to give a caveat. All right. So we have to understand that when it comes to self-care, there are these things called pernicious practices. Several years ago, I tried to come up with a name to capture this concept that everything that soothes you is not self-care. We often get into these practices that, because they make us feel good, we continue to do them and engage in them, and we realize that they're not self-care at all. So like the Amazon boxes, like they can be cool, but if you keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, and then at the end of the month, you look at your bank statement and you got a whole bunch of Amazon packages that you probably really didn't need, and it's created some issues in your financial domain of self-care, it really didn't do you any favors. Or I'm going to tell a secret, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it because I know better, and I know Katie's going to jump on me later from a public health perspective. But so I used to have this thing where I got into really liking cigars, and that was my self-care. And I convinced myself that, oh, I'll just have a cigar and that'll be my self-care. Pernicious practice. There's no way. I know better. I know it's not good for my health. And though it soothes me, it really isn't self-care. And we must understand that just because something makes us feel good doesn't mean it's good for us. And it's easy to convince ourselves of that. And again, there's a whole consumeristic framework that's designed to kind of push these things on us. And a lot of times it creates, problems in other spaces. So when you're thinking about pernicious practices that you may have, number one, it starts with analyzing your existing practices and really asking yourself, is this something that's good for me? And you have to think holistically about that, meaning something that may be good for one part of your self-care may really harm another part. Don't be fooled by the moderation debate, because I don't care who you are. And I've tried, there's no way that I could convince myself that even in moderation, smoking a cigar was a good thing for me to do. And so we can often tell ourselves in moderation that things are okay. And there are some things that may be, but there are also other practices that we just need to figure out a different way. I call it unplanning. We need to figure out a different way to engage in our self-care. And that way shouldn't include these pernicious type practices. So you analyze your practices to assess if they're good for you. You develop an unplanned, meaning a plan to stop doing those things. And then you replace those pernicious practices with caring alternatives. And so those are some really important steps in really getting to a space to where we help folks recognize and talk about pernicious practices that don't put us in a good space. So ultimately, if I'm really big into acronyms. And so summarizing what self-care is, meaning the I and the S. Self-care is individualized, right? It is what you say it is. While there are some supports and universal concepts, again, self-care is about you and how you engage in wellness and practice. Be mindful that there are pernicious practices that you need to worry about. And so you don't want to keep doing those, but you do want to think about it at an individual level as you engage in broader wellness initiatives. It is integrated, meaning it is not separate from your life. It should be part of your life. There's never going to be a time where you can do it later, or you can think about it later. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't practices that don't happen then, but it needs to be really integrated into a way of how you do your work. And then intentional. Self-care is not accidental. I wish that there was a way we could all roll into it and that be it, but that's just not the way it happens. We have to be intentional about engaging in actions that will be well for us. It is also structured. So you have to think about self-care in terms of a plan. It sounds a little cheesy to talk about self-care planning, but again, I'll share some resources. It's a very worthwhile exercise to help you think about structuring your life in a way that allows you or makes it more likely that you engage in self-care. It's SMART, meaning the SMART acronym around specific, measurable, et cetera. So you want to come up with goals and practices that fit within time limited spaces and that are feasible and something that you can do. And then sustained. Again, you have to engage with self-care as an experience. And as you grow and develop and change life spaces, self-care will look different. My self-care when I was a single person without a kid looks very different than it does being a married person with a kid. Or my self-care as an assistant professor looks very different than it does now being a dean. And so as you kind of grow and build into self-care, it will look different based on your life experiences and things you learn. So you have to and need to engage in a plan or a practice that looks at and focuses on things that you can sustain over time, because you don't want to be it'll happen come January 1st where we all go sign up at the gym, and then January we're hot into it and we're there every day. And then February comes and it's like, well, maybe I'm there. And then March, you look yourself in the mirror and say, oh, I'll try again next year, because it wasn't a thoughtful, sustained initiative. So you need to think about self-care in a way that includes activities that you can sustain, and to know that while it is self-care, it can be a group or big or broad activity. So getting other folks involved. Again, I'll share some resources. We do a lot of self-care accountability groups. We started, we call it Self-Care Band. It's a virtual accountability network. We do all kinds of things to get folks involved in the conversation about self-care. And it's always interesting to have folks who will kind of check in about your self-care. I don't really know them. They don't really know me, but we're all kind of on a similar path of trying to get to a better space. So while I may run and they may do yoga, or I may work on a paper and they may be working on a degree, we're all in the same space of trying to advance. And so You want to approach it as a group supportive collective endeavor. And particularly in academia, because it can be so isolating, it's important to include spaces to where you can be involved with others and you all can share successes and strategies and struggles together. If there are questions, comments, concerns, celebrations, anything that you have or need additional information about, please feel free to email me. Again, I'll work with Katie and Anna to get out some resources to folks to see if those things will be helpful. Again, please know that it's tough. Academe can be rough, no matter what space you're in, whether you're a new staff person or experienced supervisor. It's not easy. COVID, et cetera, has made it even more difficult. And there are folks who want to help support you on that journey. So if there are things that we can do or resources or questions that you have, please reach out because we can try to help meet those.
Thank you so much, Jay. I so appreciate you sharing your research, and I put in the chat, and Jay had it on his last slide. If you want to follow Jay on Twitter at Dr. J Miller 1, he will constantly remind you about self-care. I think earlier today I was maybe tagged on something, but it's helpful to me, to have that reminder. And so, again, thank you so much, Jay, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. I too want to thank Anna Chalfant from the Office of the Provost here at UK. Anna is the person who's helped us with registration and today's Zoom. And I just want to, in closing, say to the group that this is the final session for the fall leadership development program for the Kentucky ACE Women's Network. Our next session will be in February. And so I would encourage you to, follow us on social media or check back on our website for more information about our spring professional development program, which will again start in February. So with that, everyone have a great rest of your day. And, I appreciate all of you taking an hour of your day to think about, to be intentional about self-care. So
okay, hold on before we go. So what are the two things we're supposed to remember? Somebody tell me, anybody.
Come on, guys.
Your needs are as important as anybody else's.
Yep, that's number one. And then what else?
There's no such thing as work-life balance.
There we go. We after you hear work-life balance, just say BS and walk off. All right, that we'll be good to go there. But thank you all very much for the time. I really appreciate it. All right.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Katie and Anna.
Mhm.